Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marijke Hunter-Hesselman. On behalf of the Division for Research Development at Stellenbosch University, I would like to welcome you to our Stellenbosch Forum lecture presented by Professor Sandra Swart. The Forum lecture series was started in 1990 already, and the idea is to give the opportunity to staff and students at Stellenbosch as well as interested people from the public to learn more about the research that's being done at Stellenbosch. Researchers are requested to present their work and the academic research topics in such a way that they are understandable for non-experts in the field as well. And these lectures, therefore, creates the ideal opportunity for critical debate and interesting discussions across disciplinary boundaries. This year, for the first time, we introduced a theme, changing climates. And the idea is that changing climates affect all sectors of society, and the pace of change will likely accelerate in the future, influencing lives in manifold ways. And our response to these challenges requires cutting-edge innovations and interventions from all sectors of society. So this series of talks from leading researchers and experts at Stellenbosch University, the idea is to showcase the influences of changing environments associated with natural resources, health, education, history, and economies, and how research can be impactful in finding possible solutions in such a rapidly changing environment. Prof. Sandra Swart joins us today. The topic is Zombie Zoology, the End of Extinction. And Sandra is the departmental chairperson of the Department of History at Stellenbosch University. She received a DPhil in Modern History from Oxford University in 2001, while simultaneously also obtaining an MSc in Environmental Change and Management, also at Oxford. She's published on the social and environmental history of Southern Africa with a particular focus on the shifting relationship between humans and animals. She's the editor of the South African Historical Journal, and she served as president of the Southern African Historical Society. She supervised doctoral students from Malawi, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and she's authored and co-authored over 60 peer-reviewed articles and chapters, co-authored 2 books, co-edited 1 book, and she's the sole author of Riding High, Horses, Humans, and History. And I know Sandra is particularly very fond of her horses, and yeah, so you can talk a bit about that as well, Sandra, if there's time. So thank you very much, Sandra, from my side, from the division side, for your willingness to take part in this lecture. I'm very much looking forward to it. I know it will be very controversial as well, and a hot topic, and you'll stay true to yourself in this talk. So very excited about hearing what you have to say. Thank you, Sandra.
Okay. Oh, very, very kind. That was a lovely, lovely introduction. Thank you. I have to say, I was secretly very, very happy that you invited me to give this talk, because the forum lecture is exactly the right audience for this particular piece of work. What's happening is that this is going to be a chapter in a book I'm writing called The Lion's Historian, a human animal history of Southern Africa. And the idea is to rethink our past using not only the normal conventional holy trinity of the social sciences, race, class, and gender, but also species. So I want to tell a multi-species history of Southern Africa. And this is one of the chapters. But what makes the forum lecture great is that you don't go in with my assumptions. This is a very interdisciplinary audience. So that compels me, and all of us, to put this in terms that can be understood by an intelligent reading public, and that's exactly the audience for this book. So I would ask you to be as critical as you can be in the question and answer period, and really push me a bit, because as I often say to my students, the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in combat. And I'd much rather you point out the errors in my argument now rather than after it's published. So the contract is with Jacana Press, and we're hoping it'll be finished soon. And I think it might be, because I'm currently at the most fantastic place on earth. I'm in STIAS, the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies, and it's basically Narnia for academics. And I'm finally getting my book finished. So let's see where we go from here. Of course, I'm very happy to talk about my research into horses. 20 years ago, almost exactly, I presented a forum lecture on the history of horses. And I do remember a very dear friend of mine sitting in the front row and falling asleep. So let's see if I've upped my game since then. I would now like to share my slides. You must tell me when they appear. Have they appeared? Is there a bright red square? Someone shout it out.
Yes, yes, we can
Excellent,
see.
excellent. Well, this is what we're going to be doing today. Franken-zebra. And that's me thinking about a term called zombie zoology. And here we are. I'm going to start like this. In the beginning was the irony. The quagga was one of the very first animals afforded formal protection by the South African state. Alas, by then it had already been extinct for 3 years. On an unseasonably cold, damp morning in August 1883, the keepers doing their rounds at the Amsterdam Zoo found the last quagga mare lying dead on the stone floor of her cage. She had been there 16 years, and she was an unwitting refugee from a sustained campaign of slaughter against her kind, who disappeared from their once extensive range by the mid-19th century. The last quaggas probably died out in the wild in the 1870s. And unlike this lonely mare in Amsterdam, her fellow striped horses had wandered the grasslands at the southern tip of Africa, predominantly in the Karoo and the southeastern Free State, in vast herds. Their name, quagga, was, we think, came from a San or Khoi word, which was onomatopoeic. It was supposed to imitate their shrill barking neigh, quagga. Now, quaggas were, alas, collateral damage in a war over grazing with settler livestock. They were also sometimes hunted for their hides and sometimes their flesh, which had a thick, oily yellow fat. They were supposed to taste somewhere between mutton and beef. People had a vague feeling that they were becoming fewer, but their mobility made some people think they were just momentarily roving on ancient ancestral paths elsewhere, engaged in other migrations. And also, although the hunters and farmers had a vague feeling things were fewer, their vast numbers, coupled with their penchant, their affinity for hanging out with wildebeest and ostrich, made it hard to believe that such vast herds could be exterminated by humankind. Also, quagga was a label used very carelessly. It was basically used for anything striped. So any zebra could be called a quagga. So when the specimens on display in the European zoos died off one by one, in London and Berlin, and then our old mare in Amsterdam, no one grasped at first that it meant extinction. No one really realized and internalized that the quagga was gone until the zoo's plaintive requests for a replacement could not be met by South African suppliers. And then they realized it was a loss forever of an irreplaceable creature. But the quagga is back from the dead, and his name is Kevin. Kevin, his Facebook profile tells us, works as an assistant lecturer and expert in equine studies at Elsenburg College. His office is afield amid the vineyards in our university town, and his consulting hours are flexible. A decade ago, he was abandoned as a newborn by his mother and adopted by the Equestrian Centre. His human foster mother, a woman called Kate Hurst, received a cryptic message on her answering machine, inquiring if she could adopt a quagga. She told me that she recalls simply ignoring the message, thinking it was a student prank. She said, "I thought it was a wind-up. Even I knew the quagga was extinct." Kevin, as he became baptized, was nurtured in this horsey herd of humans. The staff and the students adored him, and his fans were called the quaggettes. And he was spoiled with birthday parties. His Facebook profile was constantly updated on his life at the college. But here's the thing. His relationship with other zebras is complicated, and his status is hotly contested. So, how did Kevin time travel to us? What does his reappearance in our world mean? How were quaggas resurrected? What I'm going to do today is explain how this program to bring back the quagga started a human generation ago in 1986 by a German-born taxidermist. And I'll explain how this fits in with a long-standing human desire to bring back the lost creatures and the steps people have taken to make this happen. The history of what came to be called the Quagga Project is explored in a context of changing aspirations. And in describing these programs, scientists have stuck to the more sedate and staid resurrection conservation, Lazarus Project, de-extinction. But I'm really trying to popularize the term zombie zoology. It's proving wildly unpopular. So I explore these changing aims and ambitions, and I ask, is this an exercise in arrogance or atonement, in humility or a godlike desire to raise the dead? Or is it simply a very human desire to reach out and touch the face of history? Of course, in this case, history might bite the hand that feeds it. Fundamental to this history are these questions, the questions I want to ask. But really what I want to get to is, should we try to alter the course of natural history, or indeed of history itself? And in this, I'm guided by two quotations that I quite like. The first is by our friend, that soppy old romantic Henry David Thoreau, who said, "Every creature is better alive than dead, men, moose, and pine trees, and he who understands it aright will rather preserve its life than destroy it." But I'm also guided by a very different kind of author, Stephen King, who did point out that sometimes dead is better. All right, so here we are. There's a long history of collegial confusion and very uncollegial contestation in classifying zebras. And this is made much harder by the great variation in striping we might find between closely related individuals. There are even albino zebras seen in the forests around Mount Kenya, an almost pure black zebra in Etosha, and on the Masai Mara, this curious little ambulatory anomaly, a polka-dotted zebra. But really, to break it down, what was the quagga? I love this picture. A quagga might be described as a zebra facing austerity measures. Nature has been stingy with the stripes. In fact, my students have said that it looks like a zebra that's forgotten to put on his pajama pants. The very few travelers' pictures like this one we have, and photos, and all the photos are of the same animal, show an equid, I think you'll agree, more ass than horse-like, with an upright mane, striped on its forequarters, but becoming a stripeless kind of dark brown, a reddish brown along rear and underbelly, with these long white socks. But in other ways, I think you will agree, the quagga and the plain zebra, look at them, seem strangely similar. In fact, a German zookeeper, Lutz Heck, proposed in his 1955 book, Grosveld in Etoshaland, that ordinary plain zebra, discriminatingly selected for diminished striping, could be bred over time to produce an animal at least visually identical to the extinct quagga. He had a throwaway line that he knew it was possible because during the war, when he was breeding normal zebras, ordinary plain zebras, a foal was born in 1940 that had no stripes on his hindquarters. Well, what can we do with this information? Enter Reinhold Rau, the hero of our story, one of history's more unconventional heroes, a very gentle, eccentric man. And he was a German-born taxidermist. He was born in 1932 in Frankfurt, but he got a job at the South African Museum in Cape Town, where the South African Museum is now, of course, called the Zico Museum. You can go to it. He got the job in 1951 and potted around in the museum, but 20 years into the gig, he started working on this quagga foal. And as you see, it was leaking sawdust, it was wobbly-kneed, big-eyed, awkwardly vulnerable. And the little quagga touched his imagination. So 2 years later, he embarked on a self-funded fact-finding mission in various European museums to assess the few remaining quagga skins available. Because Reinhold Rau had a hunch. He had a theory that despite the quagga's classification, Equus quagga quagga, as a separate species, he had begun to think that it wasn't a separate species, that it was in fact the southern version of the ordinary plain zebra, which itself differed greatly between individuals in terms of striping, with the stripes fading towards the south of the country, just as they did towards the south of the zebra in the quagga. But conservation, like politics, is the art of the possible. Rao tried to interest people in his dream by seeking state support, and state conservation officials were sternly against it. They did not support the notion. They dismissed the proposed program as merely academic exercise of very dubious conservation value, which would produce just a facsimile, just a look-alike. Rao's plan was roundly rejected by almost everyone he went to, the Parks Board, the National Zoological Gardens, the Endangered Wildlife Trust. The conservation world in the universities and in the veld reckoned that the quagga was a separate species, which consequently condemned Rao's proposal to mere caprice and fantasy, a kind of whinnying whimsy. But a serendipitous development in molecular biology was to change everything. In 1984, using tissue from this foal that you can still go look at in the Ezekiel Museum, researchers at the University of California sequenced the DNA of this little foal. And possible apocryphal literary legend says that this is what inspired Michael Crichton in Jurassic Park. But certainly what is true is that Russell Hagotchi and his team of scientists acknowledged that it was only because of Reinhold Rao not only sending the tissue, but also giving them the idea to do this paleogenetic DNA analysis. So they thank and acknowledge him for the inspiration of this entire experiment. And what they found, particularly using the mitochondrial DNA, was that the quagga was simply close kin, not a separate species of the plains zebra. It was perhaps a subspecies of the plains zebra, but not a separate species. Rao was right. So in 1986, he got a small group of South African businessmen, some wine farm owners, and some academics from UCT and Stellenbosch, and started accumulating and looking at zebras. They went on a tour. They looked at thousands of zebras, but they ended up with only 19. 19 made the cut, and some were from Shishlui and Vlozi in Zululand, and some were from Etosha, and they were looking for only two things: some level of reduced striping and some brownish tinge, not just black and white, a little hint of ochre in the coat. And they gathered 19 founder zebra members, and they set it up in a farm called Relict here in the Cape. And the first foal was born the following year. By 2004, 21 foals had been produced, some showing noticeable diminished striping. After 3 zebra generations, a milestone was reached when they produced a simulacrum of the original quagga. The foal was called Henry, and he was a doppelganger of the foal that Rao restuffed in 1969. And Henry was born in 2005, a year before Rao died. And just before his death, Rao told the New York Times, "We will have given back to the Karoo its original zebra, and that will be enough for me." So Rao died the next year, very peacefully, at his home, surrounded by his beloved dogs and pet finches. And that's the story I could tell you. That is the short history of the Quagga Project, told with a kind of confident, linear triumphalism. This is a success story. After all, an elderly, bearded hero, boldly planning a rescue operation in order to save the animals, even though called crazy by everybody else, is a story that many of us know well. It is, of course, the story of Noah's Ark. We are also used to reading about the white male heroes who saved Africa's wildlife. This one just seems a little more bookish and a lot less likely to wear khaki shorts and wrestle lions than Butch Smuts and Nick Steele. So it's a recognizable and compelling narrative. It's a story that makes sense to us, but it's only one way of telling the story. Because if one revisits the origin story, it becomes clear that there was an older motive. As a young man, Reinhold Rao had witnessed the Heck brothers raise the dead Lutz and his brother Heck had run the Berlin and Munich zoos in the years before World War II. Both were intimate with the National Socialist elite, and they embraced Nazi eco-mythology. For the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, Lutz constructed a Teutonic zoo with Wolf Rock at its center. And they stocked it with prototypically German animals like bears and lynxes. But these two men wanted to do something much bolder. They wanted to resurrect the beasts of the romantic opera of Wagner, who was much beloved by the Nazi Party. They wanted to bring back the beasts painted on the walls of the primordial caves. The brothers Heck wanted to bring back the ancient creatures of the conifers. To do so, they claimed to use the age-old method of selecting breeding, just to bring out certain desirable traits, in exactly the same fashion as the Quagga project was to do a generation later. It is demonstrably true, we all know this, that an ostensibly vanished animal's genes might be found in the gene pool of closely related kin or direct descendants. Thus, if the Hecks had begun the slow program of breeding back animals, the ones most similar to the extinct ancestors, over generations, they might have been able to re-establish something of that original being. The brothers tried to revive the aurochs, an enormous wild ancestor of domestic cattle, so formidable that when Julius Caesar encountered them in Germania in 500 BC and in 50 BC, even Caesar was scared of them, and he was not a man easily frightened. The Hecks also wanted to resurrect the Wisant, which is a forest-dwelling bison, and the Tarpan, an ancient horse breed. These beasts were intended to rewild the forests of the Third Reich as a living totem to its powers. The Hecks were working under the patronage of Hitler's head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring. Göring sought to revive an atavistic Aryan wilderness in the conquered territories for his Führer, while simultaneously reviving for himself a title, Reichsjägermeister, the Reich's master of the hunt, an honor itself extinct for 2 centuries that he had revived specially for him. Together, they aimed to repopulate the Urwald forest landscape from these animals from the Wagnerian imagination, from the rock paintings. Some of these backbred animals that they produced were released into some newly acquired real estate they'd acquired in Poland. And these romantic restorative programs of primordial purity corresponded with Nazi theories of a racialized human hierarchy on a personal and on an intellectual level. Heck's friend Eugen Fischer is known to us. He made his reputation in Southwest Africa, researching race mixing, and he helped pioneer eugenic thinking. Their colleague, the ethologist Konrad Lorenz, and you'll remember that Konrad Lorenz, of course, won the Nobel Prize for his, he shared it with Nico Tinbergen, for producing ethology, you know, the scientific study of animal behavior. Well, Konrad Lorenz argued in a key article illustrated with photos from Lutz Hecks's zoo that civilized animals and humans, and by civilized humans he meant a very special group, a very particular group, were analogous. And Lorenz believed that the domesticated beast and the urbanized human both retained, and he meant this damningly, puerile juvenile features into adulthood, which degraded their muscles and morals. Lorenz was really the Nazi you could take home to mother. For him, the Hecks were confronting this decadent degeneration of domestication by breeding back towards the wild original. Yet, what the Hecks really bred back was not purity, but a paradox. They were attempting to revive the pristine aurochs, the Wisant, the Tarpan, in as short a space of time as possible, because when Hermann Göring tells you to hurry up, you hurry up. But because of their rushed job, they actually didn't have time to breed back over the generations, as the process requires. So they simply created a hybrid mongrel of modern breeds. Lutz focused on temperament, so he brought in the French and Spanish fighting bulls and then added a dash of Corsican cattle to give the coat color. His brother Heinz mixed in Hungarian, Corsican, and Scottish Highland cattle because he just wanted a visual facsimile of the extinct aurochs. In essence, they were just creating new breeds as mere facsimiles of the extinct ones. In any case, most of the purportedly ancient animals survived only fleetingly, only briefly. The aurochs in the Polish forest were eaten by starving Russian soldiers. And when the Allies bombed Berlin in January 1944, the zoo animals burned in their cages or they escaped. Lut's son was forced to shoot a rampaging aurochs. But some of the aurochs survived at the Munich Zoo, and it was these that Rao saw as a boy, a sight that inspired him in the quagga breeding project. Years before he emigrated to South Africa, Rao had stumbled upon an elderly aurochs in a travelling circus near Frankfurt. Perhaps a trifle infradig, for the beast intended to reign with its human masters in a 1,000-year Reich. Now, of course, the Heck brothers' vision was essentially of expansion, territorially and temporally, across the borders into Poland and back in time to revive these extinct beasts. In a sense, it was a bloody refashioning of the body of history, really echoing the Nazi project itself. But the Heck cattle, those that survived, have been useful to some conservationists. Some conservationists consider them very nice and useful in preserving environments of mixed forests and meadows. They're more useful than current domesticated cattle. They survive better. They're clearly well equipped to defend themselves. However, when a few were imported to a farm in the English countryside in Devon in 2009 to perform much the same function, the British press responded in the calm, temperate manner we've come to express from the British tabloids. And my personal favourite, we were only following others. So you see, there's a very easy slippage into the species' original sin that is elided with the creator's sin of hubris, of arrogance. I think that we could perhaps refer to this as Frankenstein's sin, a familiar storyline which frames some possible understandings of the Nazi cows or the neo-quagga as monster. And this discourse blames both the animal and their creator, and the animal's a proxy for the politics that invented it. The Frankenstein story, and of course the Promethean myth that prefigured it, is for many people a typical resort when they hear about de-extinction. They say, don't touch it, don't touch it. Don't you remember Frankenstein? And here, of course, we all immediately think of Michael Crichton's novel, Jurassic Park, and Steven Spielberg's movie adaptation, 65 million years and $56 million in the making. Because that's essentially just Frankenstein 2.0. We encounter the same cautionary tale about scientific arrogance. As Crichton had his character, Dr. Ian Malcolm, ruminate, scientists are preoccupied with accomplishment. So they focused on whether they can do something. They never stop to ask whether they should do something. Well, we're stopping in this talk to ask whether we should, and if so, how we should do something. And that brings me to the other way of bringing back the dead. And that is cloning. And that is the way, of course, we see in Jurassic Park. The limits of science lag behind the limits of the human imagination, but not far behind. Movies, like the Jurassic Park, and novels are how the public come to understand science. So cloning initiatives way supersede backbreeding programs in the public imagination, especially when these were put into effect by scientists. So there have been a variety of programs predicated on cloning and bringing back through genetic, not backbreeding like the quagga or the Heck brothers. Well, they didn't even backbreed, they just made mongrel, but not like the quagga project, not backbreeding, but through cloning, through sequencing DNA. There's been a variety of attempts to get it right. And we've seen it in the Hua bird, the Pyrenean ibex, the mouflon, the Galapagos turtle, the passenger pigeon. Every time a scientist says they're going to bring back one of these lost animals, the public loves it. After all, they've seen it at the movies, only with dinosaurs, and they remember vaguely that Dolly the sheep was cloned. And they also remember that a pet dog was cloned in South Korea in 2008, which eerily echoes the Stephen King quote I shared with you. But two projects to bring back these two striped animals, of course, our friend the quagga, and then this one, the Tasmanian tiger or Tasmanian wolf. We call him the thylacine. They're often lumped together in the media and the popular imagination, but I'm going to show you that they couldn't be more different. They're absolutely antithetical in method and rhetoric and success. Well, I'll show you. In 1999, the director of the Australian Museum in Sydney announced at a press conference, he held a press there and announced his bold plan. His museum was going to clone a thylacine. You know, they went extinct 70 years before. The last one died in the Hobart Zoo, you know, in a cold snap. But no, he had found there were several preserved in alcohol, and he was going to, the museum was going to clone it and bring it back. They said that they were going to sequence the thylacine specimen, and they were going to use this poignant pouch puppy pickled in a womb of alcohol since 1866. And here it is. They were going to clone and bring it back. The director then suggested it would be possible one day to go into a pet shop and buy a pet thylacine. Surely the fantasy of every child who ever watched Jurassic Park. And it's this bombastic style of rhetoric that got him the extensive media coverage, public interest, and concomitant donations. Critics kept quietly saying, shouldn't the funds rather go to habitat preservation? But simply preserving habitat or trying to keep the last remaining animals in a species bordering on the extinct alive does not contain the Frankenstein promise of creating life, and fails to capture the public's imagination or its checks in quite the same fashion. Raising the dead also raises money. Well, of course, the thylacine project didn't work. Those kids promised the thylacine as pet are still waiting. But there were subsequent efforts to resurrect other creatures. Here's the Australian gastric brooding frog, famous for giving birth through its mouth and extinct since 1983. Frog tissue forgotten in the back of a fridge for 40 years provided the DNA, and they used eggs from the closely related great barred frog, swapping the nuclei with that of the gastric brooding frog. Although none of the resulting embryos have actually managed to survive, they have, it's true, contained genetic material from the gastric brooding frog. So here is some limited success. But these projects habitually make audacious claims ahead of what is presently scientifically possible, notwithstanding a series of heartbreaking disasters. One of these tragic calamities was the birth of the freshly cloned Pyrenean ibex, who died only 7 minutes after being born, laboring to breathe, drowning in his own lungs. 7 minutes must be the shortest period a species has ever existed. Yet in the popular domain and in some scientific circles, the hubristic rhetoric persists. Indeed, in some restoration projects, the only thing successfully brought back from the dead has been late 19th century Victorian arrogance. But I have to say that the quagga project is different. Over time, it's arrived at a place of modest self-reflection. Look, just before his death, Reinhold Rau still definitively considered the animal's outward aesthetic appearance to be the only benchmark of authenticity. He said, the quagga is a quagga because of the way it looks. If you produce an animal that looks that way, they are quagga. Perhaps it was inevitable that a man who dealt only with stuffed specimens in his working life foregrounded the visual to the exclusion of all else. But you know, the project kept evolving, and just a decade on, it went to a much more self-reflexive, self-critical, and cautious position. They changed the name of the quagga to the neo-quagga or the Rau quagga. And I think it's an important shift in classification because it imprints the animal's own history and their close connection, entanglement with us. So it acknowledges, I think, the Rau quagga, having that name, acknowledges the anthropogenic forces in their identity. As a key project member conceded, we're not arrogant. We don't know that these zebras are quaggas. We only know what an extinct quagga looked like, not what sounds they made or their behavioral characteristics. And I think that makes me think, and I wonder what you think about what a real and authentic animal or species is. For me, it reinforces the idea that a species is not so much a genetic inevitability, but at least partly a decision we make. The other thing to think about is that these restoration projects are clearly not politically neutral. Such projects are products of their historical contexts, both in terms of the technology that renders them possible and the zeitgeist that renders them desirable. So, is restoration kind of genetic revanchism, a misplaced faith in the old blood like that of the Heck brothers? I'd say, let's be careful. While the Heck project was supported by an ambitious technocratic state for potent propaganda and mass spectacle on a tight time budget, the quagga project was at the outset not favoured by the state, subsidised on a shoestring budget, absolute shoestring, sponsored by local farmers and capitalists and some academics, with the patience to plan for many generations. The first decade and a half was funded through private patronage by individuals and businesses, as well as perhaps more self-interested groups like Hunters Association of South Africa and Safari Club International. Only in 2000 was the project even formally acknowledged by the government and an accord made with the South African national parks to supply plain zebras with reduced striping. And I think this manifests the worldwide trend in de-extinction projects, which helps us see this alliance between the rich patrons, scientists, and the corporate world. It's so clear in Jurassic Park, but it's also happening in real life. DNA is easily commodifiable, it's robust, it's long-lasting, it's easy to duplicate. So it could be seen as a scramble for a new biological market. Private restoration for potential profit could be seen as a kind of neoliberal necromancy. Well, we could ask a very brutal question. We could ask, what's the point of de-extincting a quagga? And I think one answer is a form of mental restoration for people. The de-extinction of the quagga has been a conscious act of contrition and reparation. It certainly has the power to reach a much wider audience than most conservation stories. After all, think of the cousin, the mountain zebra. The mountain zebra nearly went extinct as well, but they were rescued. And that's an optimistic and successful story, but it entirely fails to grip the imagination of the public. Nobody knows about the mountain zebra. Everybody's interested in the quagga. So I think the quagga operates on a uniquely powerful symbolic level. And perhaps the quagga is only a small step in a long journey, maybe even a quixotic kind of quest. But the Royal quagga does allow us to encounter the rarest animal of all in conservation circles, one that is currently on the very brink of extinction, and that is hope. Now, there's always a strong element of battlefield triage in global conservation efforts. Some will live, others will die. Darwinian economics dictate that conservation is a zero-sum game. Not everyone wins. Many argue it's better to spend the money on the living than the dead. After all, our 300 extant living mammals in South Africa, well, about a third face a very bleak future because of habitat loss. Some scientists have called de-extinction a spectacular waste of everybody's time and a fascinating but dumb idea. Others conclude it is ethically messy or ecologically awkward, and now also really expensive. I'm out. The bulk of scientific opinion seems to lie further on a gamut from Thoreau's "every creature is better alive than dead, men than pine and moose," and much closer to Stephen King's "sometimes dead is better." But I will ask you to do a little experiment. I will ask you to close your eyes and imagine that you're in the position of Noah, the earlier messianic beardy version of Noah. And you would have to choose which pairs of animals are admitted to the ark. How do you make that choice? There is no space in terms of finance or habitat for all. Of course, even if it were possible to breed back or clone the dead, it imposes this impossible Sophie's choice. Who do we bring back? In this sense, the quagga project is unashamedly idiosyncratic. You help the one you help. You can't help everyone, you help the one you help. They've chosen this highly symbolic one, who still has living kin around today to do the backbreeding program, unlike the thylacine, for example. Simple, and think about this, Sophie's choice. Simple expense militates against all, but common sense militates against velociraptors or smallpox. Obviously, there are many people who say don't choose any. Focus on conserving living animals, not on a costly quest to bring back the extinct ones or some replica of them. Bringing them back might not even be the most costly or most difficult thing, and they might just go extinct again, especially if you privilege de-extinction over habitat. More complementary than competitive within the larger toolbox of conservation strategies. But there is another danger, something that worries me. I don't know what you think about this, but extinction is a kind of powerful motto in conservation mobilization. It marshals support, it legitimizes legislation. Quaggos and dodos and thylacines are martyrs for a greater cause. And you all know the slogan, extinction is forever. And that's a really valuable weapon in a limited arsenal. I do worry that there's a possible danger that the de-extinction initiatives encourage a kind of complacency and that they challenge the basic message of the global conservation movement. If the slogan is extinction is forever, and we say, no, it isn't, we can de-extinct things, does that undermine the power of this message? The public then might not take extinction seriously anymore. On the other hand, I think that the Quagga project can escape such trenchant criticism. In most de-extinction, there is a high risk of failure due to the difficulties of cloning, but obviously not for the Rao quagga, since they don't use cloning, they just do backbreeding. It's a very low technology solution, it's just old school breeding. Also, in other de-extinction projects, there are ecological risks of introducing a long absent or genetically modified species. Clearly, again, the Rao quagga doesn't face this. But there's something Rao said in the years before his death. He said, there are many people all over the world who are concerned about the destruction mankind is doing and are trying to stop it. I am one of them. He said, maybe I'm conservative, but I see a chance to rectify a mistake that was made. So perhaps the restoration of the quagga can act as an antidote to the pervasive and pessimistic narrative of inevitable, unstoppable destruction of species because of human activities inherent to the current sixth extinction. Because I think that kind of apocalyptic discourse may lead some people to experience kind of flooding, a hopelessness, inactivity, a passivity, a learned helplessness. So the neo-quagga might be our talisman against cynical ennui and passive resignation. It's very easy to dismiss the project as a romantic fantasy, pointing at the naivete or self-indulgence or arrogance or neoliberal ambition. But I want to say that I think there is both courage and generosity in starting a project, the results of which one will not see, like planting an acorn knowing one will not be around to enjoy the oak shade. There is also something undeniably elegant in its pre-20th century simplicity. This is not the bombastic big science claim of cloning, but rather something we've been doing as a species for 10,000 years since we started domesticating animals, breeding the animals we needed, whether for our fields, our tables, our stomachs, our wars, or for our souls. There's a beauty in the smallness of the Quagga Project's claims and the generosity of its dreams. It's really not often that the historian can reach out. Here I am meeting Kevin. It's not often that historians can touch the past, let alone scratch it on its velvety muzzle, or dodge being bitten, in fact. but accepting that species classification is at least partly a human judgment. As you see in this research, I've posed questions to the historical archives and the growing literature on de-extinction, which became this talk. And so I decided to put the very same questions to the foster mother, Kate Hurst, of the orphaned quagga at Elsenburg. I asked her the same questions that I asked the archive. I asked her, can a single quagga exist without being inducted into his culture by the herd? Can he be genuinely quagga if brought up only with horses and humans and no other quaggas or even zebras? After all, his human foster mother had noted, people are his mates, but horses taught him manners. Does he even physically look like a quagga as he was gelded or castrated at 6 months, which is hardly routine on the veld, even for a very unlucky wild quagga? Now he has a diet supplemented with commercial horse feed like molasses, lucerne, and oats. Did he learn his behavior and mannerisms, maybe even his voice from the horses he grew up with after his mother abandoned him? Does he sound like a quagga? Does he have the body language of a quagga? Does he smell like a quagga? What gives the quagga his identity, his genetic makeup, his provenance, his lineage, his ancestors, his skin color, his skull shape, his striping, his voice, his behavior, his habitat, his history, him, them, us? What makes an animal quintessentially himself? And there was a very long pause before she responded, is he a real quagga? I don't know. We just think of him as Kevin, and Kevin is back from the dead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. Wow, what an interesting talk. And I've got many questions, but I want to first go to the chat. I see Prof. Helmut Prodinger wrote some comments, which you can read, some interesting insights from him as well. I want to open up the floor and give the opportunity to anyone who listened, who wants to comment or ask a question, or yeah, please engage with Sandra.
Well, I'm certainly enjoying Helmut's. Hello, Helmut.
Absolutely.
I'm certainly enjoying your comments. So Narnia is not only a magical place through a wardrobe, but also a Swedish rock band. Excellent. That's excellent. Yes, Konrad Lorenz certainly is a more problematic figure than we thought. I also grew up reading Konrad Lorenz, Helmut. A very fine writer and very, very good with ravens, but less good with Nazism. Let's see if anyone has any thoughts. Let's have a look. Yes, excellent.
I see Dr. Berghoff. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, hi, it's Robin. Thank you, Professor Swart, so much for your very interesting talk. I have a question about, I guess, hierarchies in a sense, because I think that a lot of these discussions are about animals, right? So people get really concerned about bringing animals back from the dead, cloning animals, etc. But we also have, if I'm not wrong, sort of seed banks and stuff from plants that are extinct, right? But people don't seem to get equally worked up about sort of ethical questions around bringing extinct plants back. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that. You know, should we be equally concerned? Is it a different thing to bring to de-extinct a plant versus an animal, etc.?
No, I think we should be thinking about the same sorts of things, particularly the critique of the cloning projects. So whether it's worth the money, whether it's worth the potential dangers, because who knows whether this is an invasive plant or not. The reason why people are complacent, I think, or not complacent, rather critical, they don't worry about it very much, is twofold. The power of the visual, no one's looking at plants. It doesn't capture the imagination in the same way, even though, of course, in Jurassic Park, they made a big thing about how they brought Jurassic Park. They made a big thing about how they brought back the plants from 65 million years ago also. And it certainly is a thing. But I think the reason why people are not as anxious is because we are so clearly meddling with plants all the time. The genetic modification of plants is a massive, massive big business. And there are many groups that are very, very worried about this, but it's not the same groups who worry about de-extinction. And so I think that's it. What do you think, Robin?
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it is in the general public. I think it's largely a question of imagination and visuals and stuff, as you say. Yeah, so I think that makes complete sense. I just would like, I think, when we think about these sorts of things, to take a more inclusive sort of ecosystem view about these kinds of questions.
I think so too. And the other thing I think we should, I sort of didn't speak about, obviously, in the talk, is the idea of bringing back a Neanderthal, for example. What would be the ethical considerations there? Because, of course, there was this rumor going around in Korea that this was going to be attempted. And then there was an explosion and outrage from ethicists, as indeed there should be. But it's a very interesting question whether this would be possible. Of course, the last Neanderthal died in a cave in southern Spain 40,000 years ago. It would not be impossible. Backbreeding would be impossible, but isn't there the possibility of cloning in this particular case? So that's another ethical question. I think for me, the answer is very clear: don't do it. The answer is less clear for other scientists. But yes, Robin, I agree with you. Marika, must I look at the chat as well for questions?
I'm looking at the chat. That's
thanks,
fine.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So
thanks.
We've got another comment here from Professor Wolfgang Preiser. He says, a side aspect from a natural science perspective, with each species lost, their highly specific parasites from worms to viruses also go extinct. They are species in their own right and may have important beneficial functions for their hosts. Should not be much of a problem when closely related species still survive, but would be an issue with mammoths and dinosaurs, etc.
Yes, I agree with you. And I mean, you know, we sort of think about the worms and the viruses and even the gut biota, you know, the mammoth one is particularly interesting to me because this is a perennial thing that people are always bringing back. We're just on the edge of bringing it back. And it's in a particular place called Pleistocene Park in Siberia. And the idea was that they were going to, because of course one very frequently comes across mammoths, very well-preserved mammoths. You know, they died out very, very recently, you know. Especially on this island called Wrangel Island. So technically it would be possible to bring back a mammoth. And the idea would be to overcome the obstacle that was presented by the thylacine. The thylacine had no direct descendants or closely related kin. So there was nowhere to gestate this thing. There was nowhere to put it. You'd be looking for a womb with a view. Whereas, of course, with a mammoth, you'd be able to use living elephants. And so we constantly have tantalizing hints that they're on the edge of doing just precisely this. But I think that Professor Preiser's comments make a lot of sense to me here. These would be wildly divergent elephant species. What would it mean if they didn't have the same parasites? And for me, I'm so worried about the gut biota. You know, would we be able to even keep this thing alive? And the reason why they want to bring it back is so intriguing. It's to fight climate change, or ostensibly that's the reason. Of course, it would be a wonderful tourist attraction too, but it's to affect climate change in the Siberian tundra, which is an interesting program in itself. Did I see another hand? Thanks.
Thanks. Franz Radloff.
Hello, Sandra. Thank you for your talk. As an ecologist, I were sort of quite skeptically engaged in it and thought that it might go a bit different from what I anticipated. But thank you for recognizing the fact that it's at best a subspecies, although there's also some people who still believe it was a fully functioning species on its own because there was some overlap with, mountain zebra as well as then what we used to call the Birchall zebra. But maybe just something that I want to raise as a comment is that when you were raising the issue, that people might say extinction is okay because we can maybe resurrect in future the species if we have some elements or DNA in a freezer. But the part which must not be forgotten is the actual role and the ecosystem functioning that is supported by a species. So to simply have a species removed, can have knock-on effects for ecosystems as a whole. And I'm sort of thinking, you know, we elephants used to be present in the fynbos here in the Western Cape. And we simply do not quite understand what their role was, how they opened up this vegetation, how they utilized this vegetation, and how it actually helped other species. Now, the quagga is interesting because of its close relation to, you know, the one that we see today, the plain zebra, and hence we don't think they actually had a particular other function that now can be restored. But if you mentioned the thylacine or the Tasmanian tiger, you know, if you put that carnivore back into the system on Tasmania, you might get a real change to the ecosystem functioning there, because they don't really have any other large carnivores. So that's just a point that I wanted to make as something to consider.
No, I agree with you. And although, although the plain zebra and the quagga, you know, I suppose they mainly have the same ecological role to play, there might have been minor differences that we didn't quite pick up on. Like, it seems, Frans, as though the quagga had more propensity, more affinity for hanging out with ostriches and wildebeest than perhaps the zebra does. So there might be some minor differences that we don't quite understand or weren't recorded by the early travelers and explorers, from where we get most of the kind of everyday quotidian life story of the quagga, right? So it might even be that they had a slight difference from the plain zebra. Certainly they were able to survive allopatrically. That's interesting, and might suggest that they had bigger differences, right?
Yes, and I guess we'll just never know. And I guess the argument is, by sort of trying to backbreed something, you cannot really backbreed a unique ecological role, except if you take it very far and say this unique coloration might actually adjust the animal's habitat selection or something, which then can end up in changing again something else within the environment. But overall, that's just where we are stuck. And that's the interesting thing also with this idea of resurrecting something like mammoths. You know, if you bring that thing back, will it actually know what to do, and will it actually function as it historically did? And how much you should be learning from. And we know, for instance, from elephants, how important, you know, learning from your parents and things are. So it remains an interesting debate. But thank you. I just wanted to raise the point about the ecological function.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. And what Frans also raises for us is the idea of culture, because what isn't brought back with the body of the beast is culture. And we know how important it is. Think, for example, of one of the most heartbreaking stories you could ever hear is a woman basically my age who lives alone in the Knysna forest. And she is, of course, the last Knysna elephant. And she could live another 20 years completely alone. And in 1994, when they tried to reintroduce 3 youngsters from the Kruger National Park, they foolishly did so in winter. So they moved them from the Lowveld to the Knysna forests in winter. And they kept them in an enclosure at first, then they released them, and they hoped that they would latch on to this old matriarch, this old female. But of course, they didn't have the same culture of surviving in the forest as the female. They couldn't take it. They ran as quick as they could. The one died of stress. The 2 others ran as quick as they could to the farmland to escape the dark, brooding Knysna forests, leaving her all alone again. Then they were moved to a private park, Shamwari, and she was left alone in the forest. And it reminds us of the importance of culture to an animal. They, like us, need to learn intergenerationally. So when they bring back the beast, they're not bringing back whatever the culture was of that particular animal.
Thanks, Frans, and thanks, Sandra, for your response as well. We've got about a minute left. I don't see any further comments or questions in the chat. We might want to take one more. I think, Cindy Lee Steenekamp, she needs to leave, she says. We've got comments saying, thank you very much. You're a wonderful storyteller as well, Sandra.
I assure you, it's all true.
And yeah, Dr. Walter says, can't wait for the book.
Hello, Henry.
So we will definitely also advertise that keenly, Sandra, as soon as that gets available. So With that, if there's no further questions or comments from my side, Sandra, thank you so much again.
Marika, thank you very,
for
very much.
participating.
It's lovely.
Yeah,
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We will do a write-up of this presentation, of course, and we'll bug you, perhaps, Sandra, for an opinion piece as well. So thank you very much again. And to everybody who joined us, thank you for joining us. Please look out for future opportunities for lectures and talks. It's very important for us in the division to also create visibility for the important work that our researchers do. And this platform, of course, creates the opportunity to reach an even wider and diverse audience. So thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you in future again. Thank you.